Welcome. Welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library. My name's Toby Simpson. I'm the director of the library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. This is a very special occasion where we will be launching Karina Urbach's fascinating new book, Alice's book. And I'm not going to go too much into the book because the centerpiece of tonight's event is a conversation between Lord Finkelstein and Karina, and they will tell you all about the book. So I'll just spend a moment saying a few words about where you are tonight. The Wiener Holocaust Library, for anyone who hasn't been here before, is the world's oldest collection of material on the Holocaust. And it was established by Dr. Alfred Wiener, Danny's grandfather, who was a pioneer in documenting Nazi crimes. And he began his work in Germany, but when Hitler came to power, he fled first to Amsterdam and then to London. And today, we benefit from this extraordinary, unique resource, which he and his colleagues began and which was continued by many others, including many survivors of the Holocaust and especially German Jewish refugees. And today, it is one of the most comprehensive collections in the world on the Holocaust, and it's my absolute pleasure to be part of the team that runs it today. We now are open to the public. This is our exhibition space. Currently, our exhibition documents the history of the struggle against anti-Semitism in Europe. And part of that history is the history of the Wiener Library itself. So this exhibition is on until September. Tonight, since it's such a busy and popular event, which I'm delighted about, it's not possibly the best moment to view the exhibition. So I would urge you to come back and view it another time. It really is fascinating. We also have a reading room upstairs full of fascinating material. So I very much hope to see some of your faces here again soon in the future. So just one other thing, just to give you a flavor of the diversity and range of the library's collections, I thought I would show you a cooking-themed item. This is a pamphlet that was published in Vienna in 1938, so very much a link there to Alice's book. And it's a really funny but also a moving item. So it's called Wie koche ich in England, which means how should I cook in England? How on earth shall I cook in England? Might have been a good title as well. And so it was written by a Viennese dietitian called Kitty Köbeler. And she was really trying to help people who had gone to Britain as refugees and who were confronted with shops full of things that they may not have really known what to do with. But some of the tips in it really are charming, like the instructions about how to make tea the English way, and also the recommendation that if you're going to make toast, you should use day-old bread for the perfect effect. I'm not enough of a technician of toast to know whether that's good advice, but in any case, Kitty thought it was. So I thought that would just give you a sense of the sheer range and diversity of the library's collections. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Lord Daniel Finkelstein to introduce Karina's book.
Well, good evening to all of you. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to say something at the beginning that I haven't actually said to Karina. I deliberately held it back for now. Karina, your book is really brilliant. I think it's so I hadn't told you this partly because the last time we met I hadn't read it, and now I have, but also partly because I wanted to save it for this occasion so that you would all get the view that it was an authentic, from the heart expression of my actual opinion, as opposed to the simple politeness that normally accompanies a chair's introduction. It's brilliant. It's very well written. The material is stunningly interesting. It's a very original idea. It's a fantastic way of telling your family's story, or the other way round, a fantastic way of telling a historic story through your family. Whichever way one wants to view the book, one can view it in either way. And I think everyone who reads it will have the same view that the Times reviewer had, which is that it was that it is a triumph. So what we're going to do is talk about it, learn more about it, and I'll ask you some questions about some of your motivations and thoughts as well. But I think the best place to start really is for you just to give us an overview of what the book is, what it's about.
Yes, well, the book is a family history, of course, but it's also an indictment of theft. It shows for the first time how German publishing houses stole the authorship of Jewish nonfiction books. And that was something that hadn't been researched before. There are many reasons for that. Firstly, the archive problem, of course, that publishing houses in Germany still don't give you access to their private archives. They don't have to. And then, of course, because many of these stolen authorships were never discovered because the poor people who had written these books died or were killed in the camps, and their children were scattered all over the world. So I think that is the original side of the book. The other side of the book is about a family with all its ups and downs, with two sons who went into very different directions, and one of them was my father, and the other one was my cousin Katrina's father, Karl, and they had very interesting lives.
You say for the last bit of it, the fact that one of the brothers called their daughter Katrina and the other Karina, which is an interesting choice. They were pretty close, but that takes the limit, doesn't it? So tell me how you came to write it, because it seems like, well, that's the obvious story for a historian to write. But at the beginning, you expressed a hesitation. You didn't know that it was going to be the book that you would write.
Yes, absolutely. I was very scared of doing this because I'm a historian, and I hope that the book shows that this is my profession, and I'm a granddaughter second. So I feel like I have to distance myself from the material. I didn't want to be too passionate or aggressive about certain parts, and especially the things that were done to Alice, of course, did upset me. But I had an editor who kept telling me, no, cut down your language, be careful, we might get sued. Yes, it was difficult to distance oneself, but I hope I have achieved it. I didn't want it to be a sort of soapy memoir, because it's not a memoir at all. It has lots of footnotes, and I hope I have achieved that. I hope so.
Yes, you absolutely did. And I've been working in the same area on my own family story, and the decision about how much of yourself to include and exclude is a difficult one. But one of the things that interested me at the beginning is it's quite frank about things that I suppose a grandchild or a child might be squeamish about, which is, for example, your grandparents' sex life, and also it's quite kind of frank about your grandfather's shortcomings in several places. So tell us about what it was like finding out those things, whether you've always known them, whether you found them out for the book, and how much you decided you would cover. Fortunately, when I went through all the family memoirs, they never mentioned their sex life, so I didn't have that dilemma.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because Alice was of a generation of women who were sheltered very much, who had no idea what a married life could be like. And it must have come as a terrible shock for her to be married to a man who was obviously a gambler, I mean, who lost her money. And even though he was a doctor and on paper he looked very promising, he turned out to be a cheat, and she had a horrible marriage, and she was quite open about that. And my cousin Katrina didn't mind me saying it. Like many men in the Habsburg Empire, they had to first have their first sexual encounters with prostitutes. So, of course, he caught a sexual disease, and that was very common in those days. And Alice was lucky that she survived all that, and I can understand why she was a bit put off men afterwards. So yeah.
Was it something that you were aware of growing up, or something that you found out anew for this book?
Oh, yes. I think well, when I grew up, of course, I always knew that she had a bad marriage, and that in some ways she was relieved when her husband died, because it gave her a certain amount of freedom back. But well, the venereal disease bit I didn't know, to be honest. Yeah.
And I suppose the other bit of sort of bracing frankness is concerns the man who then looks after Alice for a period, which is her husband's brother, Ignaz, and he then, in a sort of rather shocking incident, slightly unexplained, probably committed suicide. And you decided you were going to tell that story too. Was that difficult? Did you know that too?
Oh, no, I didn't know anything about Ignaz. She wrote 24 pages of memoirs, and she said that one relative from the Urbach family, and they are here today, looked after her, and it was wonderful. And then, of course, he died, and she realized she's completely on her own and has to fight for her own survival and that of her children. And I didn't realize how he died. So I went through all these Viennese newspapers and suddenly realized that he was one of these bankers in the 1920s who got into trouble. Of course, it was a horrible time, high inflation. I mean, not many banks survived, and he had this great lifestyle, and suddenly lost all his money and decided to commit suicide because the shame was too much for him. So I think that was not so uncommon at the time, but of course the family never really spoke about that. So that was a taboo, like the sexual disease. So the banking disaster was a taboo in the family as well. I'm sure they would be shocked that I'm talking about this now.
That's interesting. Do you think they would? Because you know your family better, obviously better than we do. Or do you think actually that's sort of the kind of frankness that you've shown in this book is actually characteristic of the family, and they probably they wouldn't have done that, but they might have done other things? What do you think?
Yeah, well, to commit suicide, of course, for a Catholic family, that would have been awful. For a Jewish family, unfortunately, it was very common. And because with the rise of Hitler, several members of the family committed suicide because they couldn't face the prospect of being sent to a camp. So suicide as a way out of a horrible situation, I completely understand. But yeah, I think nowadays we can, my family is very open about all these things. So I think they have, I mean, Katrina never minded me saying all these things. So I'm glad that they allowed me to be a historian and be absolutely honest and write a life with warts and everything.
I'm glad too, because I think one of the things that the book benefits from hugely is this is a sub-theme, and it helps me understand how many people's death during the Holocaust was caused by suicide. Actually, a very interesting, important theme. And of course, this precedes it, but it shows the kind of strain that lives were under to maintain a kind of a facade or a respectability. Tell us about the research materials that you had, because there's some, obviously you've researched like this book in public, but there's a lot of, the book benefits hugely from correspondence. So where was this correspondence until you picked it up? In a box, in a bag? Where was it?
Yes, I mean, we historians always hope for this box in the attic, and sometimes they really do turn up. So the most important, I mean, the trigger for writing this book was really when my cousin Katrina gave me all these letters my father wrote from America in the 1930s. Back to Vienna, trying to get his family out of Vienna. And these desperate letters triggered something off in me. And then she had this wonderful tape with Alice's voice. And on the tape, Alice is interviewed by two other refugee ladies who are a bit younger than her. And to listen to her voice, which is a very charming Viennese voice, made me feel much closer to her. And I suddenly thought, well, this is great material. And we used it for our TV documentary as well, because we did a documentary about Alice. And then, yeah, so I had private archives. I had all the relatives were very generous. Everybody suddenly found things for me. And then, of course, there are lots of great archives in Vienna, the Jewish community in Vienna, the newspaper archives in Austria are amazing. And the National Archives in Washington and in London were wonderful, and the Leo Baeck archives. And here in the Wiener Library, they had one key manuscript as well about Alice's time in Windermere. So that was very, very useful. So I'm deeply indebted to lots of great archivists.
I don't know, maybe I've missed this, but did you know Alice yourself, and what did you make of her when you were young?
Yes, this is in some ways, perhaps it was an advantage that I was not so close to her, because I grew up in Germany. She lived in America, and she was already over 80 when I was born. So she was quite old, and she couldn't visit us so often. But she did come to Germany. She went for trips to Austria. And so she was this cuddly little sweet grandmother who was funny and full of anecdotes. But of course, I didn't know her very well. And I think perhaps that helped, because I found out about her just through the letters, through the tapes. And now I think I know her better than many people in my life.
Well, we'll come to the book in a moment, because obviously that is a core bit of sort of undiscovered history or unknown history. But your book also has an extremely important section on the kinder transport. I learned, it deepened my understanding a lot on that. So maybe tell us a little bit about why that is, on people who haven't read the book, and what you learned about it.
Yes, that was fascinating for me too, because on the tapes she talks about the children she looked after. When she escaped to England at first in 1938, she worked for an eccentric millionaire, and then she wanted to do something useful, because her son was in Dachau concentration camp, and she wanted to help. And for very low pay, she took on a job that I think I wouldn't have lasted in it for a week. I mean, it was the most horrible, difficult job. She was a matron first in Newcastle and then in Windermere for Jewish refugee children. And on the tapes, she talks about how traumatized they were, how there were all kinds of problems like bedwetting, there was stealing. Later on, when they became teenagers, the problems became more and more. And it was a very tough job. She wasn't prepared for it at all, because she was, good at cooking and running households, but she was not a psychologist. And I think it was a very tough time. But many of the children later on stayed in contact with her, and she wrote to them, and there were one or two who didn't like her, but the majority I interviewed, they loved her. So yeah, it was an interesting story for me.
Yeah, one of the most striking stories in the whole book actually is of one of the children stealing money, and when they tried to find what she spent it on, they found that she'd burnt it. Right, so it was just a sort of, it was a disturbance rather than a real theft. And anybody who argues, because that's quite a big argument in the community of people who are interested in the Holocaust, should we consider kinder transport children survivors? They should just read your book, and then end the argument, because it's obvious that they were. One thing that I just wanted, whether you could tell us, I know it's rather a detailed point, but you can satisfy me on it. So originally, these people financed this in Newcastle. But who was financing it in Windermere then? Did it get more official funding? How did this, I know it's one of the big things in the literature on kinder transport is finding all the money for it, which was very difficult because there were so many different things. Something that affected the Wiener Library after the war, when it was very difficult to find money to keep this place going for that reason. But tell us about how it was financed and the people behind it.
Yes, that's fascinating because in Alice's case, it was the Jewish community of Newcastle who financed it and also later on financed it in Windermere. But there are other groups who have done enormous amount of work for the Kindertransport, and they haven't been fully recognized. For example, the Quakers. I mean, the role of the Quakers is so amazing. They also helped adult Jewish refugees. They helped, for example, Alice's brother Felix, who later on then has to go to the Isle of Man. But they did an enormous amount of work, and it was, of course, thanks to the influence of the Quakers that Neville Chamberlain was persuaded to allow the Kindertransport because he was completely against it. Neville Chamberlain was, as we all know, big appeaser, didn't want to upset Hitler. And Sir Samuel Hoare, who was also an appeaser, was one of his, he was Home Secretary at the time. Simon Heffer is here, I think he can correct me, but I think Sir Samuel Hoare was Home Secretary, and because he was a Quaker, he listened to these Quaker committees who said, we have to do the Kindertransport, we have to get these children out. So it was private individuals, and many of them Quakers, who organized it, and then the government gave in and allowed it. And of course, this is something that Britain can be very proud of, because America, I'm afraid to say, failed. The Americans thought about the Kindertransport, but it never happened. And the British got 10,000 children out. And that was an amazing achievement by private individuals and Quakers and Jewish communities.
Yes, although they didn't finance them, which is interesting. And I think that's also the case with, you know, how the Dutch dealt with refugees. And one of the things that shocked me completely, my mother having been in Westerbork, was to discover that the Jews had to pay to build that. So the financing of it, I think, was quite a big burden on the communities. It's a very interesting section in the book. Let's move on to, I suppose, the most sort of the most landmark bit of the book, the most famous bit of the book, which is Alice's cookbook. Start by telling us about her cookbook, and then we can talk about how it's. Maybe tell us the story of the theft a little bit, and then we can talk about the meaning of it.
So after she got rid of her husband, I mean, her husband died, Alice is there on her own with 2 children, and she doesn't mind that so much, but of course she has to make money. And in the 1920s, it was horribly tough in Vienna. Of course, there was starvation, there were American soup kitchens. There was no food, and it took some time until 1925 when finally the food shortages stop and people suddenly get interested in cooking and in fine dining again. And that is Alice's big chance, because she had always wanted to become a cook. And in her family, this was a Waldorf family. They looked down on such professions. You know, you go to university, you don't become a cook. You know, that's. Anyway, so now she has the chance to finally make something out of her hobby, and she turns it into a business. She is the first woman who does catering, ready prepared meals sent to homes, and she caters for dinner parties. She gives cooking classes to rich ladies, and finally realizes that she can make a living. So she writes her first cookbook in 1925 with her sister Sidonie, and then later on, perhaps. Can we have the second photo? That's Alice sitting here in the Dirndl. It's one of these photo studio photographs. She looks very Austrian. That shows that she was the most assimilated, even though she felt Jewish, but also very Viennese. And behind her is her sister Helene, who became a lawyer. So she was fulfilling the father's hopes, and Alice became the cook. But that helped her a lot, because she starts this famous cooking school and then writes in 1935 her second cookbook. And that's the big cookbook. That's the one that is 500 pages long, and perhaps we can have a look at it. Yeah, that's Alice is on the left and the Rudolf Rusch on the right, and you can see the typesetting is very different. Rudolf Rusch is already the Nazi typesetting. So it's a German publishing house that commissions this book with lots of photos, photos from her pupils preparing food, Alice cooking food, but only her hands, they never show her face. And she was terribly proud of this book. It is her whole knowledge, not just about cooking, but also about dinner parties, about healthy nutrition, about how to run your household. It's a lot of wisdom in there. And in 1935, it becomes a bestseller. So she's earning royalties until 1938, when suddenly, of course, the Nazis march into Austria and everything changes. Now, from now on, Jewish authors can't be the authors of their own books, and this Rudolf Rusch takes over. So perhaps we can show the other photo. There is, that's Alice's edition, and then one more photo, that's Rudolf Rusch's edition. So it's completely the same. Her publishing house makes her sign a contract in September 1938, and she signs away the copyright for 2 more books she had submitted. She had submitted 2 more manuscripts on healthy cooking and something on desserts. So she gives up everything. And of course, this is a contract signed under duress. These contracts were signed all over the place at the time. She just wants to get out of Austria and would have signed anything. They could have asked her. Well, we know now that publishing houses were doing that to several authors, or I show in the book other cases. She's not the only one. And I also show how clever they were in Nazifying these books. And in the case of Alice and Rusch, they Nazify it by changing certain wording. For example, Alice in her book writes that one should be nice to the maid and understand that the maid must be lonely, away from her family. That's all taken out because Nazis, of course, had slave labor and poor women from Poland having to work as maids, so they didn't want to have such sympathetic passages in the book. They also cut out all the Jewish recipes. So when Alice talks about an omelette Rothschild, it's now an omelette nature. And the Jaffa cake sounds too Jewish too. And also in her introduction, they changed the introduction completely because she talks about how cosmopolitan food is, how global, and how much Habsburg food is, of course, influenced by Italian, Jewish, Czech, whatever kitchens, you know. So they didn't want anything international anymore. So they cut that bit too. But apart from that, everything else remains in the new Rusch book.
It's fascinating. So one of the things I did, I understood what they were trying to do, obviously, in Nazifying the book. But reading about this and 1 or 2 of the other books that you mentioned, because it's Alice's book is the centerpiece, but there are a number of other books that you mentioned that something similar was done to them. So you you indicate that it was a wider thing, not a specific thing. They seem to have done almost pointless changes. Who were they trying to persuade with that when there were page after page? I found perplexing. I can sort of understand, okay, to take Alice's cookbook, we'll just remove all the Jewish references. But in some of these other books, they seem to be just changing it so they could pretend that it wasn't stolen when it was. So it sort of suggests they sort of knew that what they were doing were wrong. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they knew they were stealing intellectual property. And I think they also, I mean, that is what the greatest crime really is, that they didn't give it back after the war, because they then claimed, and they said this to Alice as well, we have changed so much, this is not your book anymore. So that was one of the excuses. But it sounds bizarre. For example, I found other cases, and there was a medical writer, a doctor who wrote a book about healthy living, and they took out things like what was it? Homosexuality, of course, they took out because that couldn't be tolerated anymore. They erased words like prison psychology or prison trauma, because that's what they were giving to everyone at the time. And they also erased the word megalomania because of Hitler obviously suffering from it. So, I mean, it's bizarre, the things they changed. It was, yeah.
It's very interesting that they did it. One of the things about it, you obviously say the Nazis stole Alice's cookbook, but the really shocking thing in the book, as you just have said, is that they didn't give it back. So I think that one of the things that is so dispiriting in studying any of the life stories of people in your family or in mine is how people either completely forgot the war afterwards, they didn't know anything about it, or the people who did know about it just covered up their sort of crime. And this is the extraordinary thing about the publishers, Reinhardt, continuing to publish this. And it's only really when am I right in thinking it's when your book came out that they then crack and accept that they did do this, and then have decided to reprint it with Alice's name in it and redistribute it? So tell us a little bit about the story of your book coming out and their response to it.
Yes, I think what is important to know, because I say the Nazis stole the book. That's wrong, of course. It's not the Nazis, it's a publishing house. And what we thought up to now was that in 1933, the Nazis asked all the publishers to burn Jewish books and books of political opponents. But that's not what the publishers did. They didn't want to burn it because they wanted to financially benefit from it, and they wanted to benefit from it even after the war. So what they could have claimed from the time onwards, 33 to 45, is okay, we had no choice, we were under pressure, there was censorship, etc. Which isn't quite true, actually, because most of these publishing houses were very eager to adapt to the regime and very willing to do this. But the Great Guild, as you've just said, is after the war, because then they had the chance to do the decent thing and give these books back to their rightful owners. And they didn't do that. And Alice tried it several times in the 1950s. She wrote to her publisher, and she had seen the book when she came back to Vienna in 1949, seen it in one of these half-empty shop windows, because Vienna was in a terrible state, and realized it was still Rush's book. I mean, she didn't even know who this Rush was. So they could have answered her letters. The publisher didn't answer many of them for a while, and was very evasive, and then claimed that yes, we have changed the book so much, it's different now. So she was fighting for her book in the 1950s, and she could have, of course, gone to court. I mean, lots of people had to do that to get firms back, to get houses back. But these court cases were horrible torture. I mean, first of all, you needed to have a lot of money to afford to take somebody to court. And then, of course, lots of judges were the old guard. I mean, they were still the Nazi judges, so how you could never be sure to get your rightful property back. And it took years and years, and it was emotionally draining for the few people who survived. And I described this a bit in the book, because there were publishing houses who were Jewish publishing houses who were fighting to get their firms back, and had to go through lots of court procedures, and it took them decades. So Alice didn't go to court, and she didn't fight for her book anymore. And I think in some ways she wanted to move on, and that was I completely understand why she did that. And when I read your book, I realized that when you said your parents didn't want to be defined by this one by this tragic past and wanted to move on, I so much realized, I mean, you expressed this much better. That was exactly what Alice did as well. She tried to move on.
Who has the copyright now for this book?
Yes, so that was our big victory. That was Karina's and my big victory, because when the book was published in 2020 in Germany, the Spiegel, which is one of our political magazines, ran a story, an interview about it. And for the first time, the publishing house contacted me and said, we are very sorry, because they had replied to an email always saying, oh, we don't have any archive material, very sorry, etc. They had all kinds of evasive excuses before, but all of a sudden, when this was in the Spiegel, they were very, very nice about it. And the CEO of the publishing house gave us back the copyright. And now we have, I mean, we could publish Alice's cookbook. It's a bit dated, but we did publish it in a way. I mean, the publishing house was very generous by printing 100 copies of Alice's cookbook, and we donated them to Austrian and German libraries. So they are now in the libraries.
It looks amazing, her cookbook, though. Have you cooked any of the recipes? Have you cooked any?
Well, Katrina and Lorraine and my other cousin, they are here, and we did a sort of bake along on Zoom, and they made me cook I'm a useless cook, so their cookies looked great and mine looked awful. But yes, wonderful cookies.
Okay. So you refer in the book to saying that it was difficult for historians to study this area, but has become easier. So can you give us both halves of that? Explain, and maybe as we're in the library, what more can be done to make it easier in future?
Well, yeah, we have, of course, as historians, a source problem. First of all, because the publishing houses don't want to give us access. They don't need to. And sometimes we are lucky, for example, when a German publishing house is taken over by an American publishing house, the Americans always ask, are there any skeletons in your cupboard? And then the Germans have to suddenly look in the archives and say, oh yeah, perhaps, one or two things we should perhaps make public and transparent. So that sometimes happened. There were a few cases where German publishing houses had to do that. Some are open, like De Gruyter. De Gruyter, for example, asked a historian to write a book about their publishing house, and she was very honest about their failures. So that was impressive. But we have also the problem that, for example, all these little things that were Aryanized. For example, it wasn't just big firms or Klimts or these big pictures we are thinking of that were stolen, like the woman in gold. It was little things like cutlery or typewriters, and all these things were listed when they were given away or sold at low prices to German buyers. And we have these lists now, but they were a secret, or they weren't published by the finance ministries, by the German finance ministries until 2000. So because they said for data protection reasons, and so on and so forth, because they have the names, you find out Mr. Meyer bought the typewriter of his Jewish neighbor for 1 pfennig or something like that. So these files have now to be researched, and there have to be lots of PhD students who really do the hard work. It's tough to go through these files, but it is something that needs to be done, because we really need to know how much was stolen and how mundane some of these cases are, but how gruesome that very normal people just wanted to profit from their Jewish neighbor.
Okay, before we're going to go in a minute to have questions from everyone else, but let me just quickly, one other thing that obviously emerges in the book is the extraordinary story of your father, that he was an intelligence officer, that he maintained that work after the war. So did he talk much to you about that? How did you find that out?
Yeah, no, well, my father died when I was 8 years old. So I never really had this important talk with him. And I was always fascinated by his life, of course. And before I started to write the Alice story, I wanted to write about him. But my problem was the sources again. So the National Archives in Washington only gave me great sources until 1948, and everything else is afterwards is classified. So I found out amazing things about him in 46 when he wrote the famous Odessa report. And I had no idea that Frederick Forsyth's Odessa file novel is based on a report my father wrote. So I was terribly proud of that, of course. And yes, he was specialized in hunting Nazis. He was in the counterintelligence corps. And that was something, of course, he was very determined to do. And he had great friends like Cordelia Dodson, who was a very famous, well, I hope she will be famous, but she was an OSS officer. So that life fascinates, yeah, it still fascinates me. So one day I might write more about him, I hope.
He definitely deserves that treatment. And then one last thing, it's one of these books, it's a lot of the history of the family, and then you get right to the end and you're dealing almost with afterthoughts. It mentions that your mother won a Golden Globe, which would have probably been on the, so tell us about that.
Oh yeah, well, my mother, I'm very proud of my mother because she was not just a very good actress, but she was also an amazing human being and a very funny. Yeah, she was a good comedian, but in this film, which is called Wir Wunderkinder, which won, funnily enough, a Golden Globe, but also the Moscow Medal. So I thought, oh well, the Cold War was going on. It's 1960, but that film was important because she plays an immigrant in that film, and it was one of the first critical German films where they really faced the German past. So yeah, I'm terribly proud of her.
Rightly so, of course. Right, let me open it to the audience. Gentleman here, wait, just wait for the microphone. Then.
That was fascinating, thank you. Did Alice ever think of publishing the book in English when she escaped from or left Germany? Because if she'd have published it, there could have been a war about the copyright, which would have illuminated it.
Absolutely right. That was her first idea. When she came to England, she hoped to publish it in English. And then later in America, she hoped that too. But the publisher didn't give her the translation rights. So there are lots of letters by her from the 1950s where she's always asking for these translation rights and where she's saying, but your uncle, the former owner, promised it to me. And it's heartbreaking to read these letters because it was her big dream that this cookbook would come out in English and never did. But there was one lucky thing, perhaps, that when she was in her 90s, at 95, she was still cooking and giving cooking classes, and she appeared in a cooking show on American television and on PBS. And she is in that cooking show, she's still talking about this cookbook and that she hopes to translate it. So yeah, that was her biggest dream, and it never happened. I can hear you.
Okay, I'll tell you what, because it's been given it back, would you mind if I took it back and then come to you in a minute, sir? Thank you, sorry. Okay. I apologise for that.
Good evening. You know the actual, the fake author, did they actually exist?
Yeah, very good question. Yes, I'll try to find that out. This Rudolf Rösch, you know, Rösch in German means crusty, and it's almost too good to be true, the crusty potatoes or something. So Of course, I tried to find him everywhere. I even phoned up people with the name Rudolf Rösch because I thought they might be named after their grandfather. So I went through the telephone book. But perhaps here you can see, it says here about him that he is a well-known Viennese cook and a member of the Reichsnährstand, which is the food agency in Germany. So, of course, I checked in the archives of the food of the Reichsnährstand, and he's not listed there. He's also not in any of the Viennese address books listed as a cook. So I have lots of Viennese friends and they helped me to go through all these address books, and there is no Rudolf Rösch. There, I asked, of course, the CEO of the publishing house. I said to her, so who is this Rudolf Rösch? Because you published this book until 1966, and you must have files on him in your archive. Is he invented? Is he a pseudonym? And she said, no, he was a real person, but we have no files on him. So that was the only riddle I couldn't solve. And perhaps he did exist. I don't think so. In the documentary we interviewed a few cookbook authors or historians of cookbooks. And one of them thinks that it might have been a group of people. And but we can't prove it. That's a speculation, really.
Sorry, who asked?
Yeah. You say that
Sorry,
your mother was pressurized into
grandmother, yeah.
Grandmother signing away her rights. Did that apply to the really big people? I was amazed that the biggest bookseller author in Europe was in fact in Vienna, and he wrote Pity of War, but I've forgotten his name. Anyway. Yeah, that's it. He was the largest seller of books in the whole of Europe until he went. Would he have also been pressurized? Would even the big people have been pushed in that way?
Yes. In the book and in the documentary, I interviewed a historian who is an expert on Austrian publishing houses, and he researched the Palace Publishing House, which was a very famous Jewish publishing house. And one of the Palace children survived in America. And he later on wrote what had happened, that they came into his publishing house and said, you have to show us how to run these journals. You have to do that for free, and you have to sign here. And he said, what happens if I'm not signing this? And they said, well, we will send you to a camp. So he signed it, and he worked for free for them, and then managed to escape. So no, everybody was treated the same. They didn't just do it to poor little ladies. Yeah, yeah.
Just one other thing, talking about that Ferdinand Porsche.
Oh, Porsche.
Sorry, could you repeat? Yeah. Thank you.
Ferdinand Porsche had a partner.
That's right.
And he designed a lot of the stuff.
Exactly.
And they helped him escape, but they took all the glory and all the money.
That's a wonderful comparison, because they didn't just steal copyright, they also stole patents. So when you had to leave and you were like Ferdinand Porsche's compagnon, when you were an inventor, you had to sign away your patents. And that's a big scandal in Germany, because we have a book on the Porsche family, but they never, the author of that book never interviewed this Jewish compagnon, this Jewish inventor, or his family. And it was never acknowledged how much influence he had on the VW Käfer, the Beetle as well. Yeah. They just stole all his patents. So they stole the copyright of books, and they stole patents. Yes, they were very clever about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My grandfather claimed, and we never knew how likely it was, that he was in the motor components business. He was the agent for Reynolds chains, for instance. Most cars in those days had chains. And he claims that he and his elder brother invented the cigarette lighter and the beginnings of power-assisted steering. So we never knew, but from what you say, maybe they did.
Yeah, yeah. And it's hard to prove later on that you are the inventor of something, and when the patent is stolen.
Yeah, that's one of the things I found completely striking. Just the lying after the war was extraordinary. That's one of the things in the book that everyone will find. It's very difficult not to be made very angry by that. And you keep it very factual and let facts speak for themselves. But the reader is one of its, more important emotional punches. Does anyone else want to ask anything, or have we? Okay, I think that we have reached the point where people can do the best thing of all, which is to buy a copy of the book and get it signed. I really do recommend that very strongly. It's good. I can't get Karina to sign mine because I've read it on a Kindle, but the rest of you can get it at the back. Thank you very much indeed.